Good evening, namaste, and welcome to the Vedanta Society of Greater Houston and our class on the Upanishads. Om Namo Brahma Dibhyo Brahma Vidya Sampradaya Kartrubhyo Vamsharshibhyo Mahadbhyo Namo Gurubhyaha Om Shanti 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 Narayanam Padma Bhuvam Vasishtam Shaktim Cha Tatputra Parasharang Cha Vyasam Sukham Gauda Padam Mohantam Govinda Yogindra Mathasya Shishyam Shri Shankaracharya Mathasya Padma Param Cha Hastamalakan Cha Shishyam Tantrotakam Vartikakara Manyan Asmadgurun Santatamanatosmi Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Our salutations to the lineage of great teachers from the Lord Himself, who gave this knowledge to Brahma, the Creator, and who passed it along to human teachers down to our present day. To all of them we bow our heads. Om, peace, peace, peace be unto us all. So this is our class, which we began last Tuesday for the first time, a class on the Upanishads. And we are starting with the study of the Isha Upanishad, one of the shortest, not the shortest, but one of the shortest of the major Upanishads. Again, there are generally considered to be 10 major Upanishads, and sometimes 11 if Shvetashvatara is included among them, but at least 10 major Upanishads. And we will take the 11 Upanishads, all 10 of the universally accepted major Upanishads, and the 11th, Shvetashvatara, we'll take that last. Not because it's least, it's one of the most beautiful of the Upanishads, but we'll take it last because we'll first do the universally accepted 10 major Upanishads. And perhaps after that we may take a couple of minor Upanishads too, like the Kaivalya Upanishad, the Jabala Upanishad, etc. So we are studying the Ishavasya Upanishad. Last week I gave a general introduction to this class on the Upanishads, that is, an introduction to the Upanishads and their study. And we ended the class last time with a brief description or a brief translation and commentary on verse 1 of the Isha Upanishad. And so we'll begin again with verse 1 and continue forward tonight. As I said last time, the Isha Upanishad is a part of the Shukla Yajur Veda. It's a very ancient Upanishad, probably not the most ancient, but one of the ancient ones. And so it's also a very beautiful Upanishad, very profound Upanishad. Let me say that the traditional commentary, or no need to say traditional commentary, the commentary of Shankaracharya, which automatically is known as traditional because it's by Shankaracharya. The great Shankaracharya, the greatest of the Vedanta acharyas, for his influence on the whole course of subsequent Vedanta philosophy, discourse, exposition, and interpretation. There's no figure in the tradition of Vedanta since the time of the Upanishads who looms as large on the horizon of Vedanta as Shankaracharya. And that's because of his extraordinary brilliance, his beautiful commentaries on the major Upanishads, on the Bhagavad Gita, on the Brahma Sutras. In fact, he influenced the whole of Vedanta, not just Advaita Vedanta, not just non-dualistic Vedanta. He influenced all schools of Vedanta, even those like the Gaudiya Vaishnava school of Vedanta, which is that which is followed by the ISKCON, Krishna consciousness devotees. Even their interpretation of Vedanta has been strongly influenced by Shankara. Though they reject his interpretation of Vedanta, they also were influenced by him. There's no philosopher of Vedanta after Shankaracharya who could ignore Shankaracharya. You could ignore other acharyas, great acharyas like Nimbarka and Vallabhacharya and others. You could not ignore Shankaracharya because of his looming grand figure and his brilliant mind. In fact, and I know that I'm going on about Shankaracharya, but that's because I'm going to say why I'm not following his commentary on this Upanishad. So this is preface to that. There's, I forget, Thomas Coburn, I think is his name. He was a previous president of Naropa University in Boulder, Colorado. A man that I have, I can say he's an acquaintance. I would like to say he's a friend, and certainly we have a very friendly relationship. I've had dinner with him and enjoyed talking with him. He's now at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island, or at least last I heard he was at Brown. And he told me when I last saw him in Providence several years ago, when I spoke at Brown for the Mary Interlandi endowed lecture I was invited to give that year. He told me that he had often thought that if he were consigned to a desert island by himself to live out his life on a desert island and could only take one book, the one book he would take would be the commentaries of Shankaracharya. So he was the president of Naropa University, a Buddhist university. But I've spoken to others who are closely connected to Naropa University, work there, and have high positions at Naropa. They said that, well, actually, Tom was more of a Vedantin than a Buddhist. But anyway, it was very interesting that this man, a Western scholar, whose field is not Indian studies particularly, but he said that if he had one book to take to a desert island, it would be the commentaries of Shankaracharya. So Shankaracharya was brilliant, a great philosopher, a great thinker, and a great commentator on the texts. However, as Swami Vivekananda said, about all of the great acharyas, the great teachers of the Vedanta tradition of different schools, that each one of them tried to twist the meaning of the Upanishads and other texts like the Gita and Brahma Sutras to fit their philosophy. And as Swamiji used to say, the Upanishads contain different viewpoints. And so you can't do justice to the Upanishads if you try to make them all fit into one particular uniform standpoint. So Shankaracharya, he comments on the Ishavasya Upanishad, as he does on all of the major Upanishads, gives a beautiful commentary. I myself am studying it again. But Shankaracharya, one of the points he always makes in all of his writing is that knowledge and action cannot coexist. And that is true. If you are in a state of the knowledge of oneness, the very idea of being an agent of action, that disappears. The very idea of being the recipient of experience disappears. You're in a non-dual state of knowledge. Even if the vision of this world comes back, you know it for what it is. You know it's only an appearance hiding the non-dual reality. And so you continue to experience the non-dual reality to know the non-dual reality even in the midst of the sight of this universe. And so even then, the idea of I should do this and I should do that and I shouldn't do this and I have this responsibility and I have that to do, that is all gone after illumination. So he always made that point. And there was a historical reason why that point was extremely important to make. because of the rise of the importance of a contrary view of the meaning of the Vedas among those who were called Mimamsakas, those who taught that the very purpose of the Vedas is to engage people in ritual action. That's the very purpose of the Vedas. So Shankaracharya said, no, that's only for those who reside in ignorance. But the highest meaning of the Vedas is to give us knowledge of the non-dual reality, where all sense of agency and all action disappears. So, when he comments on the Isha Upanishad, also known as the Ishavasya Upanishad, as I explained last time, he says that there are some verses which are addressed to those who are ready for the highest knowledge and ready to give up action. And other verses are meant for those who are still in ignorance and need to be engaged in action for the purification of mind. They're not yet ready for the highest knowledge. But there's another way of reading the text, which I think is more true to the text itself. And that is seeing the Isha Upanishad like the Gita, which came much later. The Gita is thousands of years old, but this is much long before the many centuries at least, if not 1,000 or 2,000 or more years before the Gita. This text can be read as having a message similar to the Gita, where Sri Krishna engages Arjuna in action. And says that through action also one can come to realization, and that no one comes to inaction, that is a state of where action falls away completely. No one comes to that except through the path of action. And so Sri Krishna is constantly engaging Arjuna in action, but with a perspective that allows him to engage in action in such a way that leads to the highest knowledge. And so that seems to some, including me, to be the intent of the Isha Upanishad or Ishavasya Upanishad. So I will follow that. I will give the meaning that Shankaracharya gives, but also give this other meaning. So we'll play with these two interpretations of the same text. So with all of that introduction, let me say that the text I like most for the Upanishads, it's without an extensive commentary or without a traditional commentary. It's the series of, this is just the Isha Upanishad, but there's a series like this, each separate booklets of the different major Upanishads, translated by Swami Sharavaanandaji. He was a disciple of Swami Brahmananda and a former vice president of the order long ago. He passed away decades before I first went to India, but a great Swami. And in his translation of the Isha Upanishad, he gives first the translation with notes according to Shankaracharya's commentary. But in the back, he gives an alternative interpretation based on this idea that the Upanishad is not giving two different messages to two different people. This verse is for this group, this verse is for that group, then you go back to this group, and then you come back to this group, etc. No, he sees it as a harmonious text, and it explains some of the verses better than Shankaracharya's explanation. And that's why I will use that as the main meaning of the text. Though, again, I will say, when appropriate, what Shankara's interpretation was, so that we know that also. Let me also say, before I close that those introductory remarks, that certainly one can read the Upanishad as Shankara interpreted it. It gives a good, consistent meaning to the Upanishad. It's just that it seems artificial when you consider that it jumps from this verse for this group of people, this for this one, and then back to this one, these next few verses for these people, and then back to these people for the next few. In a small text of only 18 verses, if you take it as a harmonious message, then it seems to give a much better meaning to me. So, Let me also say, while on the topic, so this Swami Sarvananda, I highly recommend. There are other translations. There's Swami Prabhavananda's translation, which is very good. Swami Paramanandaji's translation, which is very good. There's here Swami Gambhiranandaji's 8 Upanishads. The first volume has the Isha Upanishad, Isha Kena Katha Mundaka, I think it is. Isha Kena Katha Taitirya in the first volume. And then the second volume contains the other shorter Upanishads, those other than the Chandogya and Brihadaranyaka, which require volumes in themselves. His translation is of the verses and Shankaracharya's commentary. And so it's the translation of the whole commentary. For studying Shankara's commentary, it's very good. However, because the commentaries of Shankaracharya and of other acharyas deals with the grammar of the phrases in the text themselves, it doesn't make good, clear reading in English, because you're translating into English a commentary which often is referring to grammatical technicalities of Sanskrit grammar which don't apply to English. And so Swami Gambhirananda's translation, just the verse translation, one can read and get the meaning from that. But reading Shankaracharya's commentary only in English is a difficult and frustrating exercise. What it's good for is if you know some Sanskrit and you read the Sanskrit but you're not sure of what it means, then you read the English along with it and you get a clearer understanding of the Sanskrit. Just reading the English, most people I know who have tried to read Swami Gambhirananda's translation just with the English find it very frustrating. And for those who know some Sanskrit, there's nothing that can replace the Gita Press version of the Upanishads. For those who know Sanskrit and Hindi, because this is translated into Hindi. It's the Sanskrit text, Shankara's commentary in Sanskrit, and then a Hindi translation of all of them. There are other translations. I already mentioned Swami Prabhavananda and Paramananda. There's also Swami Lokeshwarananda's translation, and I'm sure his translations of the different Upanishads are very good. I haven't studied them, so that's why I don't mention them more, but I haven't studied them. But I have studied the others, and again, I'm most fond of Swami Sarvananda's translations. So, with all of that lengthy introduction, let us jump into the text. And so let me read the first verse again, as we did last class, in Sanskrit, and then translation, and then commentary before we move on. So it says, Om Isha Vasyamidagga Sarvai Yatkincha Jagatyam Jagat Tena Tyaktena Bhunjitha Magridha Kasya Svidhanam. So that means Om. Everything in Sanskrit begins with Om. So Isha Vasyam, Idam Sarvam. Idam Sarvam, everything here. Idam Sarvam, all of this. Isha Vasyam should be covered over with God. Isha. Ish, actually in Sanskrit, there are only certain letters that you can end a word in. So Ish becomes It. It becomes Isha, by God. So everything here should be covered over by God. Now, Shankaracharya, in this, he interprets God by saying that God is the self of all. And so one, by thinking that I am all of this, so he gives a non-dualistic interpretation, which is good, and which is certainly appropriate to those of us who follow the path of knowledge. But this is an example in the Upanishads where the idea of God is used. And those of you who are familiar with the letters of Swami Vivekananda, some of you may remember a letter that Swami Vivekananda wrote to, I forget who it was. Gosh, I forget the recipient of the letter, one of his disciples, monastic disciples. And the monastic disciple had written to him saying that so-and-so, one of his other disciples, says that the Upanishads have no devotion. They're all the path of knowledge. And Swamiji says, nonsense. The Upanishads do teach devotion. And so here is an example where a devotional approach is taught. Isha idam sarvam. Everything here should be covered over by the Lord. It doesn't say the Atma. So yes, in Advaita, the real nature of even God, the Ishvara, the Lord of the universe, is the Atma, and I am the Atma. So one can interpret it that way. But why did the text say Isha instead of Atmana or Paramatmana? Why does it say by the Lord rather than by the self? So a more obvious way of interpreting it is, in a devotional way, everything should be covered over with God. So covering everything with God, what does that mean? It means seeing God in everything, coming to see God in everything. And yes, God is my own self. That's true. And so it's not seeing me as separate and seeing God as some other everywhere, but God who is the Lord of my own heart, the reality within my own heart, the Lord of my heart. As long as I feel myself to be an individual, then God is the Lord of my own heart, the mother of my heart, if I prefer, of my own heart, and the Lord of everything else. So see everything through the eyes of God. There's a great Christian saint, Madame Guyon, a French saint who was rejected by the church, and her teachings were condemned by the Catholic Church, but she was a great saint, a real saint of high spiritual experience. She says that the eye through which God sees me is the same eye through which I see God. There are many teachings of hers. Hers was a path of devotion and a path of utter surrender, but it led to a non-dual realization. And so again, even though here I prefer to take it in the words of the Upanishad itself, that he's talking about God, see everything is covered with God. In Vedanta, remember that even from a devotional standpoint, God is not separate from us. So it's not me and God, but that which is my own inner reality. Objectified is God. So cover everything over with God. So again, what does that mean? I already said that it means seeing God in everything. But God is omnipresent. God is everywhere. But also everything is a manifestation of the reality of God. Saint Teresa of Avila, another great Christian saint, a Spanish mystic, she said that at one stage of her realization that she saw God penetrating everything, just like a sponge, that a sponge is soaked with water. And so God being the water and the sponge being everything here, that everything she saw pervaded by God. And so in Vedanta we say, and it's consistent actually with her experience, but she was giving a metaphor which is never perfect. In Vedanta, we would say that God is the very stuff of the universe. So learn to see God everywhere. Whether it's through a practice like Brother Lawrence, practice of the presence of God, the God is everywhere. God is here among the pots and pans of my kitchen, as he said. He was the cook of the monastery. And so he said, I realized that if God is everywhere, God is here amidst the pots and pans and the mundane work that I do in the kitchen. And so he began to practice the presence of God, that God is here with me wherever I am. God is here present. So see everything through the eyes of God, see everything as colored with God, see everything as pervaded by God, see everything as a manifestation of God. And so Ishavasyam idam sarvam, yatkincha jagatyam jagat, yatkincha whatever, jagatyam, whatever in this universe, jagat moves. So cover everything over with God. See God pervading everything. Whatever within this universe moves. That doesn't mean just living beings moving around on legs. Everything here moves. Everything is vibratory. Everything is in motion. Everything in the universe is dynamic. Even a rock, a mountain, a planet. Everything is in motion. So see everything within this world, everything that moves, covered over with God. Tena tyaktena bhunjita. By that renunciation, bhunjita has two meanings. One meaning is, by that renunciation, support yourself. And I'll explain both of these meanings. That's one meaning. Another is, by that renunciation, enjoy. Ma gridha kasya svidhanam. Don't covet, ma gridha, don't covet kasya svidhanam, anyone's wealth. Or as I explained last time, it could mean don't covet, ma gridha, don't covet kasya svidhanam. Because whose is wealth? Whose is wealth is neither yours nor mine. How can I lay claim to anything? When everything is pervaded by God, how can I lay claim to anything? Nothing is mine. Everything is God's because God is everything. So whatever there is changeful in this ephemeral world, again using changeful in place of moving, whatever there is changeful in this ephemeral world, all that must be enveloped by the Lord. By this renunciation of the world, support yourself. Do not covet the wealth of anyone. So Shankaracharya says that this first verse is for those who are ready to renounce the world. It speaks of renunciation. By that renunciation, support yourself. What does support yourself here mean? It means that use that vision of seeing God within everything to sustain that state of mind. Use that as your sustaining state of mind. Use that, maintain that attitude that everything here is covered with God in order to sustain your life of renunciation, to sustain yourself in that awareness. But also bhunjita can mean enjoy. So by that renunciation, enjoy. Why renunciation? Tena tyaktena, by that renunciation. Because you're renouncing the material view of this universe. Our ordinary view is that this is all matter, and it's all here for me to be enjoyed. That primitive idea taught in religion, that this is a beautiful garden that God has made for us, and He's made it for us to enjoy. And we're here to enjoy this little garden of the universe God has made for us. Swami Vivekananda had very harsh words for that idea. He said, this is a paraphrase, do you think that God has nothing better to do than to make toys for you little babies? So, no, this is not a garden that God has made for us and put us here to enjoy ourselves and to play around and to have a good time. No, the world is full of suffering. And so those who awaken to the actual situation of the world, the actual suffering that we go through living in the world, then they seek knowledge in order to transcend the suffering, and also to bring the power to help others as well to transcend suffering. And so by that renunciation of that view that this world is a beautiful garden which God has made. Look at the pretty sunset and the beautiful trees and flowers. Yes, a saint also enjoys beautiful flowers, enjoys a beautiful sunset and all of that. But not from that childish, selfish standpoint that, oh, what a beautiful world God has made for me. No. See everything as God. And by that renunciation of the ignorant standpoint, sustain yourself or enjoy. What is more enjoyable if we could do it? Just think about what that state would mean. If we could see everything as God, then our problems would be solved. All existential problems, all possible problems would be solved. So it doesn't mean that there wouldn't be things in the outer world that would cause problems for the body and mind, but you would know that I have nothing to do with that. Let that go on. That's just a process going on. Now I know myself as beyond that, and I'm not bothered by it. Whatever happens in the outer world, I no longer care. That's the state of the illumined. We're not there yet. And so we care about things. But someday, just think what it would mean if we actually saw everything as God, ourselves as God, nothing but God, the divine perfection, bliss itself, infinite knowledge, infinite being, infinite eternal being, infinite unending bliss, undiminishing bliss. So with that renunciation of the ignorance standpoint, enjoy yourself, and don't covet anything, because whose is wealth? It belongs to no one. It belongs to the divine itself, but it doesn't really belong even to God or to the self. The Ashtavakra Samhita, that wonderful text on uncompromising non-dualism, says that this whole world is mine or none of it is mine. Both are true. It's that paradoxical state. It's mine as the self because I see this whole universe exists within me. It's a self-manifestation. The whole universe exists within me, the self, the infinite self. But nothing belongs to me because I am the self which is all. And so nothing, all of this is just an appearance. So when I see the appearance, it all appears within me. So in that sense, it's mine. But I know that in reality, the self alone exists, and so nothing is mine. And so everything belongs to God, but nothing belongs to God. As Sri Krishna says over and over in the Gita in different ways, that I do everything, but I do nothing. I'm the author of everything, but I'm the author of nothing. That paradoxical situation of the highest truth. So whatever there is changing within this ephemeral changing universe, cover it over with the Lord. See it as pervaded by, as coming out of God. And by that renunciation of the materialistic viewpoint and hedonistic viewpoint, then sustain yourself or enjoy that vision, which is bliss itself. And don't covet anything, because whose is wealth? So then we come to verse 2, which says, Kurvan deveha karmani jijivishat chataggas samaha evan tvainanyathetosти na karma lipyate nare. This verse, as we'll see when I get to the meaning, we'll see why, Shankaracharya says, no, this is not meant like the last one for those who have renounced the world. This is meant for ignorant people who can't renounce the world, who still want to enjoy the world. So it says, Kurvan eva iha karmani, performing action here, that is in this world, performing action here, jijivishat chatagga samaha, one should wish to live for 100 years. So doing action here in this world, one should wish to live for 100 years. Evam twai na anyatha ito sti. There is no other way than this for one like you. Na karma lipyate nare. For a man like you, for a human like you, to live so that actions don't taint you. That is, there's no other way to live so that you are not bound by action. And so again, do action here, wishing to live for 100 years. Why 100 years? That's not meant literally, that you should try to last for 100 years. 100 years was considered to be a full lifespan. It is very rare, even today, that someone lives beyond 100 years. But when we think of a full lifespan, we think of something approximating 100 years. So it means live your full life, doing action here. Thus, there is no other way for a human being like you to live so that action does not taint you, so action does not bind you. So this brings us again back to the Gita. Shankaracharya says again that this is meant just for those who cannot follow the advice of the first verse. For those who are full of desires and want to lead an ordinary life, then this is meant for them. But the Gita brings the two paths of action and knowledge together. And so that's a consistent way of interpreting this text as well. It is saying that, as Sri Krishna says in the Gita, no one can live even for a moment, kshanamapi. No one can exist even for a moment without doing work. That your very nature will force you to work. So learn how to work. So it's consistent with a similar interpretation of this verse, that the very nature of life is action. We're all active all of the time. I say, well, I'm not going to do anything. I'm going to sit in meditation. Well, if you're not doing anything in meditation, you're sleeping. But if you're trying to meditate, then you're doing something. You're focusing the mind, you're directing the mind, you're controlling the mind, you're doing something. If you say, well, I'm not going to do anything today, I'm going to sit on the television and watch TV, you're doing something. You're watching TV. I'm not even going to watch TV then. I'm just going to sit here and daydream. You're doing something. So we can't be completely without activity at any time except when we are in deep sleep. Even in dream, we're doing things. We're doing all kinds of fantastic things in dream sometimes, but doing things. And so there's no other way than this, no other way than acting for a human being like you to live in this world. So it's giving a positive view of life that, yes, live for 100 years. There's nothing wrong with that. Live for a full lifespan. It's saying, I, the Rishi, or I, the Veda, I, the Upanishad, am not giving you suicidal advice, saying that this life is worthless, so you should go out and kill yourself because the life is awful. No. Live for a full span of life, doing the action which is in front of you. There's no other way than this for a person like you because life is active. So again, that's the way I prefer to interpret it, and not just me. Swami Sarvananda gives, again, at the end, gives that interpretation, saying that that is a more harmonious meaning of the text. And it's the general meaning that Swami Ranganathanandaji, one of the great Swamis of our order that many of you have heard of, some of you have seen, and a past president of the order, that's the interpretation he gives to this Upanishad also. So only by performing action should one desire to live 100 years. Thus, and in no other way, can you be free from the taint of action as long as you are in human embodiment. So then the next verse, again, Shankaracharya says, the next verse comes back to speak to the sannyasi. So he says the first verse is for sannyasis, second verse is for those who can't do that, third verse and several succeeding verses are again for the sannyasi, and then it goes back to those who can't live up to that. But the third verse says, Asurya namate loka andhena tamasavritah tagamste pretyabhigachanti yeke cha atmahano janaah. So this says, Asurya nama te loka andhena tamasavritah. Te loka, those worlds, Asurya nama, are known as demonic worlds. Andhena tamasavritah, which are covered with blinding darkness. Those are worlds, demonic worlds, which are covered with blinding darkness. Tagamste pretyabhigachanti. To them, those go at death. Yeke chatmahanojana, those who are killers of the self. So here, killers of the self doesn't mean an ordinary, the actual literal suicide. It means those of us who kill the self by ignoring the self, which means the vast mass of us. Those who have ignored the truth of the divine self. And here it's speaking of the self, the Atmahana, the killer of the self. uh, those who kill themselves by ignorance, by ignoring the truth, the spiritual truth. They go to worlds covered in blinding darkness. So does that mean that a person, it sounds like the warnings of very strict conservative evangelicals who say that if you ignore Jesus and you don't accept Jesus, you're going to be condemned to hell. Well, no, it's not saying that. It's saying that we're actually in worlds covered in darkness right now because we have killed the self. We who are the divine being itself, one with God, we who are pure consciousness, luminous beings, by ignoring that, we have killed ourselves. We kill ourselves by thinking, I'm this miserable body and mind, full of aches and pains and impurities and so many things. To think that I, the divine being, infinite in nature, am this, I've killed myself by thinking that. Swami Vivekananda said with great pathos, man, the infinite dreamer, dreaming finite dreams. That's what we're doing. We're dreaming finite dreams in these worlds of blinding darkness. Blinding darkness means blinding ignorance. We think if we get an education, we think that we're very smart. We think that we know so many things. We can talk learnedly about many things if we have the education for it. But what is the use of that learning? What's the use of it if we ignore the higher truth of the self? A person like Swami Atmarupananda, who is completely illiterate, or the disciple of St. Francis of Assisi, Brother Giles, completely illiterate. Such people were far wiser than any learned person because they had known the self, known the divine being. And so we go to worlds covered in blinding darkness because we have killed the self. So again, Shankaracharya says that this is addressed to the sannyasis. So you start with the sannyasis, you go to people who can't live up to that, you come back to the sannyasis. But I would say, in consonance with what Swami Sarvananda says at the end of his booklet, and what Swami Ranganathananji also says, and some others have said, that here he's talking to all of us, that we are all killers of the self, unless we are uh, seeking self-knowledge or God knowledge. Again, God knowledge, the path of bhakti, or self-knowledge, the path of knowledge, both lead to the state of enlightenment. And so whether we are devotees or whether we are jnanis, followers of knowledge, it doesn't matter here. So again, the running translation he gives is, verily those births are demonic, enshrouded in blinding darkness. Those who slay the self attain to them after death. So if we ignore the self, then we die and go to worlds of blinding darkness, meaning worlds like where we are. Our condition hasn't improved. We come back to a state where we think we know something, and yet when you think about it, we realize we don't know anything. That's why those of you who have, those unfortunate souls who have had to listen to many of my lectures, know that I often start a lecture by not classes like this, but a lecture on a particular announced topic. I often start by questioning the meaning of the topic I'm speaking about. Because we think we know things, we think we know what dharma is if we've studied Hinduism. We think we know what God is. We think we know what religion is. We think we know who I am. We think we know what the world is. We think we know what matter is. But when you look, we think we know what the ego is. But when you look at any of these basic concepts that are the basic foundations of our knowledge and experience, we find even these things we don't understand. Even these things we use them all of the time and we have no idea what we're using. We can give definitions and things, but when you look into them, you find our definitions are words only. We don't really know what we're dealing with. And so this is a world of blinding darkness. And we go continual life after life, to worlds of blinding darkness, until we begin to seek the self, until we begin to seek God. So the next verse also, and several more verses, are, according to Shankaracharya, for the sannyasi. But again, I take it for all of us. Each of these verses is addressed in a harmonious way to all of us. So let me go over this next verse, and I'll stop there, verse 4. I'll stop there, and if there are any questions. So if you have any questions at this point, you can write them in the comments section on YouTube, and Sam Ghosh will give them to me at the end after announcements. So verse 4 says, Ane jade kam manaso javi yonai na deva abnuvan purva marshata tadhavato nannatyeti tishtat tasmin napo maatarishva dadhati. So anejad, it doesn't move. Ajad means trembling, shaking. Everything in this universe is trembling, shaking. Everything is vibratory by nature. Everything is dynamic. Even a rock is in constant change and constant movement. The mountains are in constant movement and change. The planets are in constant movement and change. So that reality, and speaking of the reality, the divine being, which we're to cover everything here with, which we are to see ourselves as one with, it unaged, it doesn't move. Ekam, it's one. And as you know from studying Vedanta, one means actually non-dual, because when there's only one and no second, so sometimes it's said one without a second, then even the idea of one disappears, because one is enumeration, and it brings up the idea of 2, 3, 4, 5, 0, minus 1, minus 2, minus 3, etc. But if there's only one and no second, then it's not even one. But here, that's understood. So it says it doesn't move, it doesn't change, it's one. Manaso javiyo, it's faster than the mind itself. Manaso javiyo, faster than the mind. The mind is the fastest thing that we know. If I want to go from here to the mailbox, I have to walk. I used to be able to run. now I have to limp along slowly, and I eventually get there. But in one moment, I can think of the mailbox. My mind is there. In one moment, I can put my mind there. In one moment, I can think of India. My mind is there. So the mind is the fastest thing we know. But the divine being, the self, that which I am, is faster even than the mind. Why? Because I'm here, I think of India. I put my mind in India, but I find that self is already there. It was already there. I get there and find that it's already, the consciousness of the self is already there. The consciousness of the self pervades, the consciousness which is the self pervades everything. I look through a telescope and see a distant galaxy, but the self is already there. It's faster than the mind. In one moment, by looking through a telescope, my mind can go to the galaxy. And yes, I know the scientific explanation that, well, the light from the galaxy has come here. But this isn't speaking, this is speaking in poetic terms, not in scientific terms. And the poetic terms are true. That in one moment, my mind can go to the galaxy through looking in a telescope. But when I do that, I find the self is already there. Isha vasyamidam sarvam, cover everything here over with the Lord. Because, why? Because the Lord is already present in everything. So cover everything over with the Lord. Think of everything in divine terms, because that's the truth. And so when I see and send my mind through a telescope to a distant galaxy, I find the self is already there. The self is wherever I put my mind. So my mind is so fast, and yet the self is faster because it's already reached. So manaso javiyo, faster than the mind, na ena deva apnuvan purva marshata. the senses cannot outrun it, because when the senses go to their objects, they find the self is already there. It's already beat them to the spot. So here it says devas, the gods, but here the devas refer to the senses, because in the Vedic times, each of the senses, the eyes, the ears, nose, tongue, skin, everything was governed by a divine presence, by a deity, was directed by a deity. And so the deities themselves are sometimes, or the senses themselves are sometimes called deities. And so the Naina Deva Apnuvan, that reality, the senses cannot outrun, because they find that the reality is already there when they light on their objects. Tadhavato nanatyeti, running, anyan atyeti, running, other things running at full speed to arrive at a distant place. They find that the self is already there, tishtat, stable. The self is there still. So it's like you're having a race with your friend and you're running through the country and you're each to find your own way there. You can take whatever path you want, but you have a goal that you're going to, and you're racing there, and you run as fast as you can with the shortcut that you know best. And when you finally get in sight of the goal where you're to arrive, you see your friend resting against the post where you were to race to. And so it's like that. The senses running as fast as they can, going to their objects, they get there and find that the self is resting there. The self is there standing, is there resting. So it's a beautiful image, because the self is that which doesn't move. And yet it's faster than anything, because it's there before even the mind can get there. But it gets there by standing, by being stable. It never went anywhere. It's just standing there, but it's already reached. Tasmin napo matarishwa dadhati. By its mere presence, it enables the cosmic energy, matarishwa, to sustain the activities of living beings. Here, apo means water. But water is a symbol here, and sometimes in the Veda, it's a symbol of life and life activities, because water is one of the foundations of life. And so that matarishwa dadhati, tasminapo matarishwa dadhati, means by its mere presence, it enables the cosmic energy, matarishwa, to sustain the activities, apo, of living beings. So the whole verse runs, the self is one, unmoving, unchanging. It's faster than the mind, manaso javiyo. Having preceded the mind, it is beyond the reach of the senses. The gods, the senses, run to their objects and find that the self is already reached. So it is beyond the reach of the senses, ever steady, tishtat, standing, ever steady. It outstrips all that run. So we run and run and run, but we find it's already there at the goalpost. By its mere presence, it enables the cosmic energy to sustain the activities of living beings. So all of the activities of this universe are sustained by that cosmic energy. And so again, as Sri Krishna says in various ways in the Gita, that I do everything. It's by me that all of this energy is manifested, that everything moves, every leaf trembles by my will, and yet I do nothing. And so that self is still, it goes nowhere. It's unmoving without any action. And yet it's through it that everything here happens, that all the manifestations, this dynamic world of creation, that everything moves by the presence of that. So as we'll see, this line of thought will continue for several more verses. one of the beauties of this Upanishad, one of several, is that it speaks in paradoxical language. Those of you who have studied Taoism, the Tao of Chinese thought, Lao Tzu and Chuang-Tzu, they started that tradition of paradox, or maybe it would existed before them, but we find in them that paradoxical language is used with great effect in Chinese thought from their time forward at least. And that is the type of thought that the Zen inherited. When Buddhism went to China, it eventually was transformed into the school. One of the schools it transformed into in China was the Chan school, known as Zen in Japan. And that also, like Taoism, it uses the language of paradox. And so paradox is one of the ways that religious truth can be expressed. That is, you present something which to the logical mind is a paradox, and yet it's true in spiritual experience. And so it's one way of showing that which is beyond the logic of the mind. There are other types of religious language, the language of metaphor, the language of poetry, the language of philosophy, analytical description, and so forth. But paradox is used here in some of the verses of the Ishavasya Upanishad, the Isha Upanishad, and also I think we'll take next the Kena Upanishad. That also is full of paradox. In fact, verses in it sound very much like the Tao Te Ching of Lao Tzu. So we'll stop with this verse. Next time we will continue the same line of thought in verse 5. So let me give announcements, and if there are any questions, I will take those after the announcements. So 4 announcements. On Thursday, we will continue the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna class at 11 o'clock. And on Sunday at 11 o'clock, we will have the usual Sunday lecture, and I haven't yet worked out the schedule for April. So I can't give you a topic yet, but we will announce it shortly and send out the April schedule by mail as well, email, as well as posting it on the website. And then next week on Tuesday, we'll continue with the study of the Isha Upanishad. So this will probably go for another 2 classes. And then we will begin the Kena Upanishad. So yes, see what, okay, good. Schopenhauer's idea of the world as will and representation seems to be similar to Advaita idea of self, but will is used instead of self. Can we equate will to self? Yes, that's a very good point. Schopenhauer, of course, was deeply influenced by the Upanishads, and his philosophy was deeply influenced by the Upanishads. However, as Swami Vivekananda said, that we would disagree with his stating will as the highest reality, because in the self there is no will. Will is something when you have subject and object and a world. The world is the context where subject and object can exist. So you have subject, the self, a world, the object, and the context of that, the world. Then you have will. But when there is non-dual reality, where is will? Where is will? And so even the divine will, when you speak of everything happens according to the will of God, yes, that's true, and that can be experienced. It's a very high experience, but it can be experienced for those on the devotional path and also even those on the path of knowledge. Ramana Maharshi used to always speak of everything happening according to the divine will. But that will is not will as we know it, and it's not the highest reality, because again, to repeat it one more time, as Sri Krishna says in the Gita, everything happens by my will, and yet I do nothing. And so the higher reality is that God does nothing. God is. Tishtat, as it says in the verse we just finished. Standing, doing nothing, everything happens. And so we would say that that was a shortcoming in the philosophy of Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer was a great philosopher, deeply indebted to the Upanishads, a great lover of the Upanishads. He said, in famous words that are often quoted, that the study of the Upanishads is the most wonderful study one can undertake, that they have been the solace of my life and they will be the solace of my death. But we think that that's a point that he misunderstood or misrepresented. Not misrepresented, that indicates that he intentionally did something. And maybe he even understood the point of the Upanishads, but felt that will was supreme anyway. I don't know. I haven't made that deep a study of Schopenhauer to say. But we would say that that he was wrong there. So, my greetings to everyone. Namaste to everyone again. In closing, good to see the greetings from people in the chat, from dear friends and devotees. And so let me give a closing chant, and we will see you in this class next week. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnamevavashishyate. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat. That infinite reality is full. This relative universe is full. From out of the fullness of that infinite being, the fullness of this universe has come. And yet that being remains ever the same in its perfection. Oh, peace, peace, peace be unto us and to all the beings of the universe.